Okay, with that, as people still filter in, I'll get started. Welcome to today's event on designing cities for families. Our event today will run for approximately 1 hour, followed by an open Q&A session. If you require tech support, please private message Colton, that he has CSPC in brackets right next to his name. We also invite you to share the Indigenous territories that you're joining from today. If you're unsure of the host nations of your land, you can always visit nativeland.ca for North American Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. We also encourage you to rename yourself with your first name, preferred pronouns, and an organizational affiliation if applicable. We request that you keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question during a designated Q&A period. We encourage you to use the chat for discussion with attendees. And also, if you want to ask any questions of the speakers, we will capture them there. We require respectful dialogue at this event, so if your behavior or language is disruptive or harmful, we reserve the right to put you in the waiting room or remove you from the event. Thanks for making this space so thoughtful and constructive, as you guys always do. And also thank you very much to the United Way of Southern Vancouver Island for partnering with us on this event. This event is also part of our ongoing RHAP project, which we will talk about shortly. So before we get started, just a territorial land acknowledgement. The CSPC acknowledges the Songhees, Esquimalt, Tsarlit, Sikkim, Sawat, Pakchin, Suk, and Shawnee and Pachadot nations who have a historical and ongoing relationship to the land where our offices and work are based. We also respect the wide diversity of nations and languages across the province. British Columbia is home to over 200 First Nations communities and approximately 50% of the First Peoples languages in Canada. So now a little agenda for us. I'm going to start with a little bit about us at the CSPC, a backgrounder on today's event. Then we're going to move into our guest speaker presentations, a community response panel with some dialogue, and then we're going to open up the floor to an audience Q&A before wrapping up sometime around 1 or 1:15. So a little bit about the CSPC. The Community Social Planning Council provides reliable information and engagement processes that inform decision-making across all sectors in order to support broad-based social well-being. In terms of our values, we value the attainability of a healthy, sustainable, just, and vibrant community, that accurate and accessible information is a tool for positive social change, that marginalized voices need to be part of the social planning process, and also the necessity of broad-based processes of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So a little bit about the project that's bringing us all here today. The RHAP project is partnered with Colwood, Saanich, and the City of Victoria, and we are looking to do some other partnerships as well. So sorry, my slides are a little bit hung up here. The RHAP project is looking to build on the existing base of housing needs reports, recovery and prosperity strategies, and indexes to bring the focus onto housing poverty and pathways to affordability as well. It supports the economic development by supporting a community of practice around municipal issues surrounding housing affordability and housing action. And part of this project involves profiling local challenges around housing poverty and housing affordability solutions. Some things that we've done so far have been literature reviews and case studies from other jurisdictions, sharing local and global best practices, profiling housing poverty and vulnerability, compiling local policy practices and shared learnings, as well as community engagement with municipal, business, community partners, and members. So what brought us here today? And thinking about housing affordability is very topical for us today as we are moving to talk about affordability for families within our region and our cities. I do want to go back and highlight that territorial acknowledgement, as it's important that we recognize the colonial policies and practices that were designed to eradicate Indigenous cultures across Canada, which has caused extensive health and social implications for Indigenous people living here today. This impact of colonization has led to Indigenous peoples living off reserve and in urban centers to experience homelessness and housing insecurity at a disproportionate rate, making up a substantial percentage of people experiencing homelessness right here in the CRD. From our 2020 pit count, almost 1/3 of Indigenous respondents were Indigenous respondents, and they came from 29 communities across Vancouver Island at a higher proportion than any other group surveyed, with 46% of them having their first experience of homelessness at the age of 18 or younger. Over half, at 52% in 2020, indicated being in foster care, a youth group home, or a child welfare program as a child or youth, something we can solve by designing better cities for families. Families build healthy and vibrant communities, and unfortunately, our housing crisis in Greater Victoria is having a detrimental effect on the fabric of those communities and our social, economic, and health. These days, we hear of families of 4 crammed into 1-bedroom units or housed in precarious situations, and sometimes their existing housing situations are changing and there's nowhere else to rent within reach. So today, we're going to be looking for solutions to try to remedy some of the problems that we've seen in terms of housing affordability in our region. Speaking with us today will be Sam Roberts, Communications Officer for the Housing Assessment Resource Tools at UBC, or HART for short. Sam will be going over some of the housing needs assessments that we're going to be looking at to assess what those needs are and where they're most needed. And we're also going to be having Virginia Holden speaking today, the Executive Director of the Greater Victoria Housing Society. On our community response panel, we're going to be having Julian West, a Victoria developer and founder at Urban Thrive, Doug King, the Executive Director against Together Against Poverty Society, and Scott Bradford, Executive Director of Thrive Social Services. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Laurel Collins, if she's here with us right now, to give a short address.
Thanks so much, Kadoni, and sorry as I struggle with my my mute and unmute button. Yeah, just first of all, it's really great to see folks' faces. I'm Laurel Collins. I'm the Member of Parliament for Victoria, and it's really an honor to be here with you talking about these critical issues. I'm zooming in from the homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, and I think Kadoni put it very well. You know, this, whenever we do these kind of land acknowledgements, it's critical that we are not only reflecting on our relationship to the land and on Indigenous communities' relationships to this land, and you know, expressing gratitude for how they have stewarded this land since time immemorial, but also to acknowledge the ongoing injustice that Indigenous people face. And in light of our discussion, the overrepresentation of Indigenous people and the unhoused in the street community, and that we are collectively committing to fighting alongside First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples for justice for Indigenous people. Yeah, I want to just extend my heartfelt thanks to everyone who has put this event together, and the Community Social Planning Council team for organizing it. I see a lot of familiar faces in the Zoom today, and also some new faces. And I just want to thank you all for being here and engaging in this really important discussion. We know that everyone deserves a safe, affordable place to call home, and yet the housing crisis is really ravaging our communities. It is taking an immense toll on the people here in Victoria, in the Capital Regional region. And the reality is that families and individuals, seniors, single parents, students, you know, across the board, we see people struggling. And it is the most common concern that people raise with me as their Member of Parliament. And people are really at the brink. They are struggling, and they are calling on governments at all levels to provide solutions to this crisis. In the most recent housing needs assessment that the City of Victoria participated in, 21% of residents were identified as having a core housing need. And this means they are living in unaffordable housing or in housing that falls below suitable standards, or are without housing. And this rating is higher than almost every other municipality in the country. And we know, because of a report done by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the government's own watchdog, that the Liberal government's national housing strategy has actually left people in core housing need worse off than they were before, which is completely unacceptable. We just saw a federal budget, and we were able to push and deliver some important investments for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing. There was $4 billion for urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing, and important investments in a housing accelerator fund. But in general, this 2023 federal budget was not only disappointing for renters, it was dangerously short-sighted. And this month we hosted a housing roundtable here in Victoria and heard from housing providers. One of them shared the statistics that for every one affordable unit we build, we're losing 15. So my NDP colleagues and I are pushing for a national affordable housing program, one that is inclusive of diverse housing needs, that really addresses the urgency of the crisis that we're facing. I think we need to directly address the fact that real estate investment firms are buying up housing, pushing renters out, jacking up rents. So we've proposed a plan that would not only have the government building 500,000 new units, but also provide a fund for cities and for nonprofits to buy up additional units and buildings and keep those rents affordable. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel and from the speakers today. It's amazing having people who are working so tirelessly in our community to support renters, to support their clients. And so I will pass it back to the moderator, and thanks everyone for being here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laurel. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to introduce Sam Roberts from UBC's HEART team. Sam leads communications for the Housing Assessment Resources Tool. She has experience across a number of industries, including fine art, professional services, medicine, and community development. Sam has a particular interest in affordable housing and housing justice as well. So without further ado, Sam Roberts.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I did not expect that little bio. Thank you. My name is Sam. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver. I am the communications officer, as you just heard, for the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project based at UBC. But I am also someone who grew up on the South Island. And so I'm particularly pleased to be speaking to you all today about the needs in the CRD and to hear from some other folks that care about housing and housing justice. And so, yes, I will get started. I know that there are a few folks in here that are already familiar with our project, so forgive me, please. I want to make sure that that I get a fulsome overview, but the HEART project, we're funded by CMHC. We're a nationwide project that seeks to help communities across the country understand their housing needs and make decisions to address them. I'm hoping that the slides are changing. But okay, good. So we have 3 different tools that we just published actually last month. So a housing needs assessment tool, a land assessment tool, and a property acquisitions tool, all of which, like I said, are now on our website, shameless plug, heart.ubc.ca. So a little bit about these and what their purpose is. The housing needs assessment tool is a census-based tool that measures core housing need and affordable shelter costs by income category, household size, and priority populations. Our methods allow for governments to set effective housing targets that will lift Canadians out of chronic housing need and homelessness. The land assessment tool is a mapping tool that assesses suitable public land for nonprofit affordable housing based off of proximity to key services and amenities. It allows governments to effectively use land, including housing, on top of things like libraries, healthcare centers, et cetera, to maximize deeply affordable homes. And then finally, our property acquisitions tool is a policy-based tool that helps prevent the loss of affordable housing through property acquisitions by government, nonprofit housing providers, and community land trusts. And I was so excited to hear Laurel reference acquisitions, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But today I'm going to focus on some of our findings from the housing needs assessment tool on housing need, and then go over some of the ways that some of the opportunities that the CRD has to address that need. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to kind of browse through all of our outputs, projections, that kind of stuff. Right now, our website only has the 2016 census data on there. But I'm going to show you some stuff from 2021. So we actually haven't published this yet. So this is kind of a first look. But before we do that, I really do want to cover some really important caveats about looking at 2021 data, because the census was taken during the height of the pandemic, when the federal government was distributing the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So over a third of Canadian workers who earned at least $5,000 in 2019 received CERB payments in 2020 from, up to a maximum of $14,000. Low wage workers were the most likely to receive CERB payments. And for the lowest earning households in the capital region, income in 2020 increased by up to 700% temporarily. So keyword, the census was taken at a time when folks were having an extraordinary increase to their income. And after CERB ended, some households went on EI, which pays $100 less per week than CERB. And at the time, almost 3/4 of former CERB recipients were predicted to be worse off. So there's certainly a huge amount to think about when considering the numbers that I'm about to show you. And also to look at them in context of 2016 as well, because all of this is contextual. The growth of our communities is contextual, as well as affordability. So with that in mind, I will start with our kind of household income categories and shelter costs. To introduce the data, these categories, you may be familiar with seeing quintiles or deciles. We use income categories because they tell a little bit of a better story when it comes to the lives of folks that are in these incomes. So for reference, you can consider of these 5 categories that very low income folks are generally on shelter supports or other government payments. Low income category is about the equivalent of a full-time minimum wage job. Moderate is a lot of those starting salaries for professionals. Median is standard kind of professional jobs you might expect, or kind of more senior other jobs. And then of course, high income is everything above that. So to give you kind of a sense, you can see how that's all laid out here, as well as what their affordable shelter cost is for each of those income categories. And we use the 30% of pre-tax income, which is the metric by the CMHC. So we're thinking about families, thinking about how to build communities that serve families, and how to build communities that thrive and grow. There's a huge need for affordability in lower incomes, in smaller households. About 55% of low-income households in the 2021 census in the CRD were in core housing need, and that number rose to 71% of very low-income households. But that need is not just distributed in those lower incomes. So you can actually see this shows the distribution of households that are in core housing need and what their household size is. So you actually do have a good amount of need in the moderate and even the median income households. But you can see here that unlike the very low and low incomes, they predominantly need 2, 3, 4 bedroom homes. That's where their need is. And there's not currently in existence in the CRD affordable, suitable housing for these households. So the way that it's measured, it includes what's available in the community. And so those kind of higher income households and small families can't afford or find housing that has that suitability for them. And that really goes back to Kajoni's reference to, 4-person families stacking up in a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom. There's just not that availability or suitability. Also really important to highlight that marginalized communities face housing need at a greater rate. So making sure that we're building housing that serves those communities in addition to the community at large. So we use priority populations. You can see that in the CRD, 1 in 4 single moms are struggling to find affordable housing and are in core housing need. And then there's also a lot of need with very young folks. So those under 25 and the very elderly over 85, who often have smaller households and lower incomes. So you can see these kind of patterns evolving when you look at housing need with household size, as well as marginalized populations. This kind of data can inform how we plan projects and specifically where nonprofits can step in and provide housing for certain communities that are disproportionately in need. And this all lines up when you look at the affordable housing deficit. So there is a huge need for 1- and 2-bedroom homes that cost under $1,000 per month, but also a sizable amount for larger homes that cost under $2,000, and a total of over 22,000 missing affordable homes in the region at the 2021 census. I can't emphasize enough that this is the floor for affordability, and that considering CERB and also the immense amount of growth that we've seen in the region since the last census, all of the changes in housing, that number is probably a lot higher. And that can be really overwhelming. I know that a lot of people that I talk to share that it seems kind of doom and gloom with housing and housing need in Canada, in BC, in the CRD. It's hard to imagine reaching those kinds of targets, but there's actually also a lot of opportunity to kind of address it and address it in meaningful ways that are sustainable well into the future. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them. The first one I'm going to talk about is land. So research shows that land can account for up to 80% of the cost of building in urban centers. For most projects, it would be up to 30%, but in those kind of bigger cities where land is more expensive, it can really be a huge, huge amount of that cost of building. Conveniently, government has lots of land that can be free leased to nonprofits to build affordable housing. In the CRD, that pencils out to about 127 square kilometers of urban land. That's not, keep in mind, caveat to that, it's not measured out. We don't have the data for the CRD on what's occupied, what is suitable or not suitable. That's just the blanket urban land that's owned by all 3 levels of government. Our land assessment tool addresses that need by identifying that viable public land that's close to amenities. And we found in a lot of communities that we work with that it's actually the municipal land that's closest to things like schools, parks, medical centers, transit. And so municipalities have a huge opportunity to transform their communities simply by leasing this land to a nonprofit to build for free. This is something that they can do at little to no cost. And so there's an option there. You can also do things like co-develop. So we've also done a lot of work identifying buildings or land that's owned by the government where there might be a 1-story building. Maybe there's a post office or a library, and you have the option to build housing on top of that. There's also the option to co-develop land with amenities. So in places like Langford and Colwood, I know that there's been a lot of development over the last decade, and a lot of what people are talking about is there's so much housing, there's not enough infrastructure. And so you have the ability to kind of make those things happen at the same time. Another way that we can address affordability that Laurel has already mentioned is by preserving existing affordability where it stands. Over 500,000 units costing under $750 a month were lost in the last decade. This loss can be because of gradual price increases, but we've also seen an increasing amount of redevelopment of older stock into new, less affordable places, which just degrades the level of affordability and options that are on the market. Property acquisitions, including renovations, can cost up to 25% less than a new build. So a lot cheaper. BC has shown a lot of leadership with the rental protection fund, and a lot of governments have started to look at acquisitions as a part of a healthy housing strategy. And BC has a really great nonprofit sector that can run and maintain a lot of those buildings. But there's also a lot of legal tools that are available to municipalities that support acquisitions that cost nothing. And so some of those best practices, I can't go into them for time. I know that I'm already over, but they're available in our acquisitions report. I really encourage you to take a look and consider some of the ways that your community might be able to address some of that need. So now we've gone over some of our need and our opportunities. Let's imagine briefly what a healthy community looks like. So from a housing and homelessness perspective, every community, of course, wants to move towards functional zero homelessness with sufficient and culturally adequate supportive housing. This is where affordability is key. You know, supply is really important in a lot of ways, but we need affordability because the market cannot provide that kind of very low income threshold that a lot of folks need. We also want to see steady decreases in core housing need towards zero, which supply and nonprofit housing can support. And to achieve that affordability piece, nonprofits can play a pretty key role. And we think that it's really important to move towards doubling our nonprofit housing and moving towards at least 20% of the market as nonprofit to meet the needs of the very low and moderate income households. And then affordability also looks like median home prices coming back down to 3 times the area median household income. Again, that comes with ample supply and options across the spectrum of housing. And the whole purpose of this presentation is a thriving community also has families. And that's the main topic of discussion today. We should be aiming for at least 20% of family-sized housing with 3 or more bedrooms at a range of price point throughout the city and region. And co-development with amenities can be a really great tool to move towards a 15-minute city model instead of deserts of housing with no schools, cafes, or other essential services. With that whirlwind tour, I know it was really fast. I want to invite you to connect with our project. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, our website, heart.ubc.ca, or send me an email. You can reach me at contact@heart.ubc.ca. And thanks so much again for having me today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. That was a beautiful and very informative presentation for us today. Next up is going to be Virginia Holden. Virginia is again the Executive Director of the Greater Victoria Housing Society. She has worked for over 15 years with the BC government in leadership positions related to affordable housing development, policy, and community engagement. Virginia is also a registered professional planner. So without further ado, Virginia Holden.
Hi, thank you. And thanks everybody for having me here today. I'm really talking about a topic that I'm very passionate about in terms of finding affordable housing for families. So I'm just going to press slideshow. Hopefully it works. Oh no. Aha. Hopefully everybody can see that. Of course, it changed my camera off to the side, so it looks like I'm staring off into space. So bear with me. So a little bit about the Greater Victoria Housing Society. I think many of you know about our society. We've been operating in the region now for about 66 years. Our mission is really to provide affordable rental housing for low and moderate income households.
Virginia, just letting you know before we get started, your notes are showing right now.
Why is it doing that? I know it did something really funky. I don't know. Thanks for letting me know about that. I'm not sure why it's doing that.
If you want to show it this way, it also works.
Yeah, if people are okay with that. Otherwise, you see my notes. No secrets in there. Okay, so let's do it with this. I don't know why it's kind of alternating with my other screen for some reason. So again, we provide affordable rental housing for low and moderate income households. Originally, we were started as a seniors housing organization about 12 years ago. The board really shifted into knowing that families and working singles and couples really needed assistance as that need grew in the region. Right now, we serve just around 1,300 individuals and just have under 1,000 units under ownership and operations. And we also have roughly around 200 units of housing for families. So that is at 2 to 3, 4 bedroom units, and really looking to double that over the next couple of years with projects that we have in the pipeline or under construction. And it's being funny. So my apologies for the technical stuff. We always try to iron it out and sometimes it throws you for a loop. Anyway, I think we've, Sam did such a great job and she's going to hit some of the themes that I'm going to hit as well. Really talking about need and what are some of the tangible actions that we can do to preserve this type of housing in the community, but also knowing that we need to build more of it. And what I think of, affordable housing for families, I kind of think of it a little bit as a public policy superhero. So as previously mentioned, I've spent some time in affordable housing policy with the province, and affordable housing for families just hits so many different topics in our communities that we struggle with. It's looking at social policy, it's economics. It helps us, make sure that we're, welcoming newcomers to Canada in a way that they can feel integrated and supported in their communities. It helps us look at equity, knowing that stronger and more equitable neighborhoods that have a diversity of outcomes, benefits us all. It helps, parents stay engaged and kids to stay engaged in school. So it helps with education. And of course, we know that housing, stable, secure, and affordable housing is a major social determinant of health. So if we know why this is so important, one of the things I want to talk about is some of the key actions that we can look at to advance affordable housing in our communities. So one, I just want to talk about a little bit about one of our residents, Stanley. So Stanley and his family, and this was just recently profiled with BC Housing. Stanley and his family were newcomers to Canada, and he came over first, and his family kind of came a year or so behind him to try to get settled. He found that renting for him as a single person, affordability was an issue, but he was able to find a few options. Once he started to try to bring his family over, what he found right away is people didn't want to rent to little kids, and really had to settle for whatever he could get. So he was able to find a 2-bedroom for his family of 5. But again, the little kids wanted to run and play, and the neighbors downstairs really started to complain about noise. And he really spoke about how, dreading the knock on the door every day. And he knew that that kind of space just wasn't available to him. So they reached out, worked through BC Housing through their housing registry, and really stayed on that registry for years and years. Eventually, he was able to find something with our organization, properties that we had been building over the last couple of years, because we've kind of maintained this focus on building larger units. But what it really highlights is there's not enough supply out there for families of this type that is affordable, and we really need to start prioritizing housing for families. So in the past, it's great that we've had federal governments and the provincial governments come to the table with funding for housing, but what they've often prioritized is unit numbers. And that can, with the high cost of construction, and as Sam said about the high cost of land, what that ends up happening is that we start to see a lot of units that are studios and 1-bedrooms, and those are needed in the community. So I'm not negating that. But again, it's the need to prioritize these larger units for families. And what we really need to start to do is think about what is the environment that families need to thrive. They need to be in areas that are walkable and safe. They need to be in larger units, often ground oriented in existing neighborhoods, with space for play and close to transit and schools and amenities. So I encourage folks to really look at your land use and community policies and incentive programs and really build those relationships with developers and builders who help build this type of family housing, or landlords that currently operate it. Ask how we can do more. What's getting in the way? Why isn't this type of housing being built? And look at those opportunities and really start to prioritize how are we going to not only, as Sam said, preserve the housing that we've got in our community so that it isn't destroyed that in terms of that affordability, but also prioritizing how we're going to build more. So just putting a focus on prioritizing this type of housing is extremely important. I won't go into this too much. Sam nailed it on the head, access to land. It's a huge, huge issue. As we know, the price of land, the cost of land in the capital region and throughout British Columbia is very costly, and it is often constrained. And so for us, I think Sam talked about it being 80% of the cost. It's a huge cost. And so being able to access land that, whether it's municipal or public lands, to help us, as nonprofits build those kind of partnerships, or whether it's co-development, I'm all ears on that. If we look at Pacifica's Dalmatian building that just opened up over top of the brand new Victoria Fire Station, that is a model that doesn't need to be unique to Victoria or that fire station. It is one that can be replicated, and one that nonprofits like ourselves are very interested in pursuing. So land is it's often our largest and most expensive constraint to new housing development, and cheap and free land can make the difference between getting housing built at all or keeping the rents low. Also, I wanted to speak to just, access to land for other types of market housing, like co-ops and, duplexes and townhouses, and some of that missing middle. That's extremely important supply. And, looking at housing reform, like the missing middle policies, or, some of the provincial announcements, is very important as well. I like to call this one Mo supply and Mo options. So we need all of them. And I wanted to highlight, this is Townley Place, and my apologies for the resolution, it's not showing up very well. So Townley Place is a affordable rent 3-story apartment building for 55 plus, and then 10 3- and 4-bedroom townhouses in the back for families. And so this is in the Camosa neighborhood of Saanich. It's kind of at the junction of Saanich and Victoria and Oak Bay on either side of the street. It's very focused on sort of low and moderate income households, and it's surrounded by a single family neighborhood and across from the school. We need to be doing a lot more of these, because we have the opportunity in the land. Victoria is blessed by having a grid. And, something that, where it's easily walkable and bikeable, and it's close to transit, and you can walk to amenities. And so how are we going to get a lot more of these housing types built? Because it's great for kids, families in here talk about being able to let the kids run across the street to the park, walk to school, and hang with the neighborhood gang and build that community. We need to be doing a lot more of this, and take it away from families like Stanley having to wait, 3 to 4 years to get into something like this, or whether, almost like you won the lottery. So we need a lot more supply of this type, along with townhouses, other multifamily, duplexes, and co-ops. Sam also touched upon this, so I won't go into too much detail, but protecting existing affordability is so important. Some research statistic about, for every, 15, for every one unit that we're building of affordability and affordable housing, we're losing about 15. I've heard, some numbers down to 7 in some parts of our province, but that's a staggering statistic. So if we're talking about trying to, and it's hard to build affordable housing, but yet we're losing so many out the back end. I mean, that's something that is just digging ourselves out of a hole that somebody keeps throwing dirt on. So we really have to take a look at that. I encourage everybody to check out the inventory of your affordable rental housing stock in your communities. Really understand it, who owns it, what are the opportunity there, how is it zoned, because protecting this is super, super important. And it's wonderful in British Columbia that, we do have a provincial government who's looking at this. I just came back from the National Housing Congress in Winnipeg. I mean, we're the envy of the country right now with this protection fund, $500 million to nonprofits. But it helps to protect this existing rental, but it also helps to protect the land for the future. So this is about protecting those equitable land assets for the future and having a non-market housing provider, be able to, whether they're operating it now or redeveloping in the future, it protects that affordability long-term. I also want to note about housing subsidies. Something that the provincial and federal government have been doing more and more, and this is really important. So not only do we need to protect the existing, but we also need to protect the existing affordability of the renter. So, because it could really help to offset rising rents and other costs. So, recent increases to income assistance shelter rates. We now have a renter's tax credit in British Columbia, and the importance of things like the renter's assistance program through BC Housing. One of the things as part of this Congress, I found out that poor housing need across Canada actually dropped through COVID. And there's one reason that happened, and it was CERB. So, being able to protect renters and help to deal with their costs in their existing housing is a really important tool. I think this has been touched on already, but it serves really, really important action, which is funding for affordability and larger units. So all levels of government really need to step up with more funding and support for housing for families. New developments that are coming online are great, but they don't, and we need that new supply, but sometimes these rents are often priced out of reach for low and moderate income families. The reality is that larger families units are expensive to build. And without a government partner, access to free and very cheap land, they're almost impossible to build. So, housing societies like GVHS are often not given the grants necessary to build these units effectively, and they are costly to operate. I mean, I have 2 boys and they're not gentle on things. So, nonprofits like us who have made it a priority to build this kind of housing type, we often build them at a loss. So something has to be done with that. And I understand the new provincial government refresh of the community housing fund is going to prioritize some of these larger units so that they are easier to build for nonprofits and other players in the market. This one is an important one, and I believe that there's a lot of work happening on this, but we really need to make sure that, local governments are not only helping to partner on land, but expediting approvals and waiving development fees and taxes. This is a big, big piece. And I often kind of just give the kind of very short and glib, costs go up, rents go up. There's no magic in the formula. So any way that, approval times can be expedited and costs for non-market, nonprofit players is extremely important. And, there's great work out there happening right now on this issue. So the rapid deployment kind of program for nonprofits in Victoria, the province has just announced about digitizing permits. There's pilot grants through the development approval process review, DAPR. And then I believe Laura kind of talked about the Housing Accelerator Fund, which I understand from CMHC is going to be rolling out the door sometime in the next couple of months. So those are great things around streamlining capacity, and they are necessary. Partnerships, I've mentioned it already, partnering up to get some of these affordable family housing homes built is how we get it done. We're willing to, nonprofits are willing to partner with local governments and the private sector on the development or purchase opportunities. And we try to make sure that they're in the right place for families. But we do need to make the numbers work. The financing, the funding, the land, the cost to develop, they all influence the type of housing that we develop and what rents we need to charge. So, you know, so there is success in numbers. You know, finding those agencies who want to work together, and local governments play a really great role in this. And as community organization like the Social Planning Council is finding folks that have similar missions and mandates, and pairing them up and exploring options is really important and very powerful. And last but not least, advocacy. So, you know, making sure that you know, getting the word out there about the importance of families in our community, you know, to build new homes, attend public hearings, write letters, get your voice heard, and that, you know that, you know, families are essential to our communities in so many different ways in terms of its vibrancy and longevity and sustainability, and that we can't function or thrive without families being part of the fabric. So with that, just my quick 8 things that we can do and we can action on. And with that, I'll pass it back to our moderators. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Virginia. That was a really informative and engaging presentation as well.
Thank you.
Now we're going to be moving on to our community response panel side of things. So I would like to invite our guests up as well to be spotlit. We have, there we go, Julian West, Doug King. And where is Scott?
I saw him around here somewhere.
There we go. And Scott Bradford. Those. And joining us as well, we have some elected officials in the room as well, from City of Victoria, Oak Bay, and Saanich as well. So welcome everyone here. So if you guys want to give yourselves a quick introduction, starting with Julian on the top left side.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Julian West. I'm the owner of Urban Thrive. I specialize in car-free housing. So I have big emphasis on family-oriented housing, 3 bedrooms, but also intergenerational living, encouraging families to live with other generations and create that sort of sense of community. We very much deal with this challenge of how do we provide attainable family housing in our region, especially the core region. So I'm very familiar with the struggles that Virginia was speaking to in delivering family housing. So happy to be part of this conversation.
Moving just over to Doug King.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Douglas King. I'm the Executive Director at Together Against Poverty Society. We're a legal nonprofit organization based in Victoria. We also have offices now in Nanaimo. Our focus is really on providing assistance and support for tenants once they're in a residential tenancy relationship. So a lot of our work is on maintaining tenancies and ensuring that once somebody gets into or accessing a tenancy, that's going to be a successful tenancy, and also supporting them through the various processes that happen, legal processes specifically, if there's conflicts with either other tenants or landlords within that tenancy.
And last but not least, Scott Bradford.
Hey folks, thank you for inviting me to this. Those 2 first presentations were very helpful and I appreciate that. Thank you to both Sam and Virginia. My name is Scott Bradford. I am the Executive Director for an agency called Thrive Social Services here in the Greater Victoria area. We work with 2 sides of our business. One is through MCFD funding around children, youth, and families to ensure that they have every opportunity to reach their potential, working through at times some rather serious issues around mental health or family preservation, or families living with children and youth who have special needs, diverse abilities, neurodiverse ability. The other side of our business service is around adults with what used to be called intellectual disabilities, which we refer to as diverse abilities, and helping those individuals to live a full, life within the communities that they choose to be in. My background, I spent 13 years in Ottawa. And I think it's a little bit more appropriate, that experience in terms of housing. I ran an agency that did wraparound services for children, youth, and families that were living in low-income social housing complexes. Ottawa went through a transition to become a doorway community in the late 90s. And we saw a flood of new Canadians, refugees, immigrants into those communities, large social housing strategies put in place, and the fallout of poor, well, just reactionary planning to those situations, and what that looked like in those communities, and the struggles that young people particularly had trying to adapt to a new country, a new language, racism, discrimination, and how we, over 13 years, or the agency I was working and running, adapted our programs to ensure those young people at least had, and I hate to say a fighting chance, because there was a lot of that going on in the early days, but at least a chance to reach their potential through critical hours services. Because when kids aren't at home with their families and they're not in school, those out of school hours of after school, weekend, and summers become critical. And who they hang around with and what programs and they're involved in and what adults they interact with makes a huge difference in the trajectory of their lives, in how they have their families' lives, and the communities in which they live. So I come with a little bit of background and scars, and from seeing the rollout of public policy and how nonprofits played a role in all of that, and looking backwards now, it's 20 years that has played 23 years that has played itself out. So I'm seeing some of the great stuff that happened, and some of the stuff I wish had been in place for better outcomes. So that's my background, and I'm hoping to add to this rich discussion. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. So at this point, we're going to be asking some questions to our panel and having a little bit of dialogue going on. But I also want folks who are in our chat today to leave their questions in chat, and we'll be scanning through and we'll pick some of those out as well and try to get to those. But to start things off first, I have a question for our panel. And that question is, we've heard a lot about some of the barriers that currently exist in creating new housing stock for families. Now that we're all sitting in this room together, how could we think about the ways in which you could remove those barriers or make it easier to usher in some of that housing from both the non-profit and for-profit housing sector?
Maybe I'll jump in here quick. And I guess I just want to set a little bit of piece of context here to say, we have a broad housing crisis, and we talked a lot around how it's impacting like lower and moderate income households, which, it's a broad crisis, but it acutely hits those households. Families, in addition to that, are disproportionately impacted. And then families who are low and moderate income are further disproportionately impacted on that. And there's a need to kind of help serve those families that need the most support, and giving them sort of like that sort of wraparound support to achieve all these things that we talked about. But there's also just like, we kind of have a broken housing market right now, and we have a broken housing system. So there's a need for providing like direct services today, and there's also a need to just like let's fix the system. So and there's just like family housing in particular really highlights the challenge. So as an example that Virginia touched on, like family housing is bigger, right? So a 2-bedroom might be 750 square feet.
but you're looking at more like 1,250 square feet for a 3-bedroom. That's just more expensive to build, right? And when people are already struggling to meet sort of a baseline cost, it's just that much harder, right? Especially when we're looking at just, you know, families that are on modest incomes. So, I gotta highlight, like, this is such a complex problem. We really gotta tackle it from multiple perspectives. And from my perspective, I focus very much on family housing. For me, process is the number one challenge. It can take me 2 to 3 times longer to work through the process and get approval to build housing than it is to actually build the housing itself. And that's a fundamental struggle. And I don't think we're ever going to get beyond that. You know, we're losing 15 affordable homes for every one that we provide if we don't look at the system in which we provide housing for, you know, us as a society.
I think just following up on Julian, and I don't want to take up, because I think I got my key kind of 8 points across in terms of actions and key messages, but just following up something that Julian said, I think we've got shortages across the whole housing spectrum. And so, you know, although, you know, I intensely feel, you know, the lack of options for low income, especially, and especially those larger units. And that's where the governments really have to come to the table, like the province and the federal government, to help us subsidize building those units and keeping them affordable in the long term. But what is happening now is that there's so much pressure even in the private end, so, you know, affordable rental or, you know, home ownership and cooperatives, that's kind of pushing down on the stock as a whole. So it's really kind of a full court press across the whole housing spectrum to build more supply and more of these options, right? So that it's not just an apartment, a social housing unit, or a single family home. Like, that clearly isn't working. And so that we need to look at basically the whole spectrum, and we need to build more. And again, protect some of those units that are currently affordable so we don't lose them, and do some things like, really let these red subsidies do their jobs.
I might just add on that when it comes to housing, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's no one thing that will solve the housing crisis. If there was, I would hope that we would have done it by now. I know that a lot of folks really like to focus on funding from the provincial and federal governments. I want to take a little bit of pressure off of Laurel here, in that, like, I would love if the government was able to provide us with billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars to build housing that is so desperately needed. But I do think that there is a lot of work that can be done at the local level, where governments are more agile, where there may not necessarily be funding, but there are things that can be put in place that enable as much housing as possible. So things like development permits. I know that that's something a lot of communities are talking about. Things like parking requirements, like zoning requirements, setbacks, FSR, all of that stuff can be evaluated. How can we make this as amenable as possible to building housing? And even if it's not just for all housing, for not-for-profits, for the folks that are building the most affordable housing in your community, there's a lot of legal mechanisms that communities have access to that can support nonprofits to build housing, that can support affordability in their community, that can preserve affordability in their community. And so, even with the audience that we're looking at here today, there's a lot of power to do that kind of work that pushes the needle slowly but surely in that direction of achieving affordability, and then being able to move quickly if and when that federal and provincial funding rolls in.
Just to quickly build on that, it still kind of amazes me that municipalities aren't doing essentially what Sam said, like just rolling out the red carpet for non-market housing providers. Just like take away the fees, prioritize like the reviews, just strip down like the requirements and like the back and forth stuff, and in like 6 months, like let them go from like application to start building. Like just just let it happen. And like, don't constrain it to such small areas as well. Like, still 90% of our region like is basically off limits to any kind of like more affordable multifamily housing. And like, I think we should be able to put like at least a 4-story affordable apartment building in the middle of like Oaklands or Fairfield, because that's what we need, right? And like, if there's like a non-market housing provider that's ready to go with that, and we have some very proficient, very talented non-market housing providers in our region, just like give them the red carpet, like make it easy for them, and let them go, go to town on it. And I think they will, right? The barriers and the process, even for like non-market providers, is still quite substantial. And like, that's low-hanging fruit. Just like, let's just not get in their way. Let's let them do their thing.
So Karen Harper and Century, and I agree with everything that's been said today. I'll probably be shot at dawn or something, but one of the concerns that I have is that we have 13 municipalities that need to do this. So let's set amalgamation to one side. But as the province is looking at, because I agree, the process at this point is really where we need to focus. And it's really challenging when the processes are different from municipality to municipality. So that's one issue. And the other thing I will just point out, and I don't have the answer to it at this point, but certainly in Saanich we're seeing, and it's not specific to lower cost housing, but it's specific to the housing issue, is we're seeing more pushback than we've ever seen before in really odd ways. And so any help that the senior levels of government could further provide to help us to do the kinds of things you're suggesting, which I think most councillors would probably agree with, but are challenging in the current political environment, quite frankly, would be helpful. And I think I'll just leave it at that, but I think there's a will amongst many of us, but sometimes I feel like, how many times can one fight this battle? And I know it's for all of us, but I think of one where I was apparently on Twitter, not me personally, but being talked about on Twitter as I was fighting the fight, and we did get there, but it was something else.
And just one more remark from Dave Thompson, who has his hand up here.
Yeah, hi everybody. I just wanted to emphasize a point that I guess has been alluded to a little bit. And when I think about family-friendly housing, I just think of my own experience as a parent of kids living in Victoria, from elementary to middle school to high school age. One of the most important things for them is that they're able to use our neighborhood and our streets safely and independently. And so, having them able to, bike around, walk around, take transit, having slow streets where we're not expecting a vehicle to come tearing around the corner at high speed. I mean, there's been some tragic incidents in the last few years. Having the kids be able to use transit is another important thing for family-friendly housing. When my kids became eligible for free transit passes, their use of transit and their access to the rest of the city dramatically increased. They were able to get around and do things and kind of grow up and be more independent. So I think of the type of neighborhood where I grew up as kind of hostile to families. And it was a neighborhood where you absolutely needed to be driven around by your parents. And that was very friendly to people who drive cars. It was not very friendly to people who have kids. So anyways, I think that's one of the key aspects for families. And I just wanted to mention that Victoria is going to be, Victoria, Virginia mentioned the missing middle. A few people have mentioned the rapid deployment of affordable housing initiative. We've got a lot of stuff going on. One of the biggest opportunities, I think, for people who are interested in this is that we have an official community plan update coming up over the next couple of years, which can really help us to shape the type of communities that we're going to have in the next 10, 20, or 30 years. So I would encourage people to who are interested to provide their input on what they would like to see in terms of family-friendly communities. So if you're living in Victoria, I can throw some email addresses into the chat, but send your input into staff and council. And I'd encourage that for the other communities as well. We did briefly touch on advocacy, but we really need to get out and get our voices heard on what makes family-friendly communities to municipalities and to the CRD. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dave. And I believe Carrie Smart has her hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment from another municipality's perspective. Hearing we can be really agile at a local level. I totally agree. I have the hope for that. I think what we struggle with in Oak Bay the most is staff capacity to roll out these changes. And I'm really excited to see what the Growing Communities Fund and the HAF are going to bring to our ability to leverage consultants to get some of this work done. And so on May 8th, we're going to, I think, have a really dynamic council meeting looking at a lot of these options. And I'm really optimistic at how it would particularly we can look at streamlining processes to make some of this happen. So
thank you for sharing that. I do have a few more questions, but I would like to open it again to anyone who is in the chat, any other participants who may have their own questions that they'd like to ask.
Kedoni, can I jump in there for a response while people are preparing questions?
Of course.
Yeah, awesome. Great to hear, Carrie, that the work is being underway in Oak Bay. And just to jump on Dave's point, we focus very much on affordability in this conversation, but it is just one piece of the puzzle for when we talk about family housing. And I can tell you, there are developers that I know in Victoria who've been trying to provide family housing, 3 bedrooms at the rental or ownership level, and they're actually really struggling to provide those units. And the big challenge that we have right now, especially from an environmental perspective, is like we have a net loss of family-aged adults and children from our core area, and they're going to the West Shore, right? And when we talk about affordability, it is more affordable, quote unquote, in the West Shore than it is in the core downtown area, where it's more walkable, it's more bikeable. We have lower transportation emissions and so forth. But we also, we have not made a concerted effort to design communities for kids. And I'll give you a really sort of concrete example of this. I have a small sort of houseplex project in the rezoning process through the city of Victoria, and it's on a little street with no through traffic. So they cut off through traffic. You can bike through it, you can walk through it, but you can't drive through it. And it's created this really beautiful, unique aspect of the community where kids come out to play there, and then all of a sudden a tire swing shows up on the boulevard tree, and kids from around the block will come and walk to this part of the street and play. And it's one of the few areas where we're actually cultivating families in the sense of family community, but that's become really rare in our core area. And a lot of it comes down to community design, and a lot of it, especially for young kids, comes down to traffic. We just don't want our kids to play around traffic because it's dangerous. So we need to think about these things and make sustainable transportation options easy, the convenient option. And we need to be sort of really thinking about how we blend family-oriented housing with where we put traffic and how we mediate between those spaces. So there is this broader thinking, as Dave was alluding to, around, if we really want families to stay here, we have to intentionally think about how we're going to make it friendly for them, how they're actually going to be successful as families here. And that affects families of all stripes.
Thank you for sharing that, Julian. Kind of touching on that, and I think something that has been brought up at many times during the CSPC webinars, and also something that a lot of municipalities are looking at exploring, are fewer vehicle kilometers traveled. So we do have a question in chat talking about how meeting the 25% less traffic, so that VKT target, could help us in meeting that by creating more affordable, child-friendly homes that don't require us to be owning a car. So does anyone want to maybe comment on this shift towards development that is seeking to put multimodal, so walking, biking, and public transportation ahead of the car as the primary way that we navigate through our cities. And I believe Andrew Cusack from the City of Victoria had their hand up as well. Was this about a new question or kind of in response?
No, it was a new question. So if you wanted to focus on that piece first, that's fine.
Perfect.
Well, I can talk about this topic for ages, but I've been taking up a lot of air time. I'm happy to let anyone else jump in if.
Yeah. And at this time as well, I just want to let everyone know that our time is currently at 2:10. So if there's anyone that does need to leave now, I would say thank you so much for coming out to our event this afternoon. It was great to have you here. We will continue on for about another 10 minutes if all our panelists are okay with that. Maybe going through a couple more questions from the chat.
Maybe, Virginia's got her hand up. So Virginia, maybe I'll let you take first crack at this question.
And I see Dave has his hand up too, so I don't know if it's a question or response. So why don't you go ahead, Dave, and then I'll chime in.
Thanks very much. I'll try to keep it brief. Yeah, I'm a strong supporter in city councils making decisions about the kind of community that they want to have in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, as opposed to what the community looked like in their fond recollections 20, 30 years ago. And I think that this is the direction we're going. There's clear direction from the BC government about reducing vehicle kilometers traveled, as has been discussed. Victoria has also adopted a target in that realm. I think it's a 20% reduction. Council has directed staff to go away and look at Schedule C, which is our parking bylaw, which sets minimum off-street parking requirements, and asked staff to advise on bylaw recommendations that would eliminate off-street parking requirements for the majority of lots around Victoria. And this isn't to say we're going to eliminate cars or even that we're going to eliminate parking, not at all. It's just that we're going to allow people to make their own decisions about how much parking to provide, as opposed to stipulating you have to provide some, even if the residents living there don't have cars, which incidentally creates a cross subsidy. So municipalities can take steps to correct the over provision of parking, and in appropriate places, municipalities are able to maybe put in parking maximums. That's another discussion, but I think certainly reducing or eliminating parking minimums in a lot of parts of town is a useful step that municipalities can take.
Perfect. Thank you so much for showing that, Dave. I'm going to go over to Scott quickly to respond to this.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a big advocate for the walkable solutions for particularly for vulnerable or at-risk, low-income children, youth, and families. We have seen lots of situations where, you know, a park is built and there's no supports around it, and all it is a collecting zone for gangs and drug dealers to find at-risk youth and start to groom them. So, you know, when you look at places around this region that are in rapid growth, some are in, I think, some of the fastest growing areas in all of Canada, and you look at massive housing and just a variety of individuals and backgrounds moving in, you really need to have those walkable and you know, what is a family appropriate or parent appropriate distance for a young person to go to get services that, you know, are not part of the school system. That is really important, to have those catchments in areas for those kids to have really good quality after school, weekend, and summer programs, because without them, you can have all the housing you want, but 10 years down the road from now, without those social support services, you're going to have some very serious social problems. So just constantly putting that out there, that the discussion is about housing, but it's also about wraparound services. And we haven't really even talked about primary care and the lack of doctors. Like, you know, the West Shore has, I think, 11 doctors. It needs 45. So when families are deciding where to live and they can't get a family practitioner, and there are no after-school programs, and there are no childcare programs. It's just, you know, I would not want to be one of those parents having to make that choice.
And then just going over to Virginia, did you still have your hand up there?
No, I'm going to pass it on. I think some of the stuff, you know, themes have been covered. I see some other hands up, so I want to make sure that there's time for those. So thank you.
Perfect.
Donnie.
So I'll go down to Sam.
Yeah, I think very quickly on kind of reducing miles traveled and being mindful of the community policymakers that we have in the room, that it comes down to a lot of these things may cause a little pain. There's not going to be a lot of enthusiasm to someone who's very used to going to work in comfort in 20 minutes and then being told, you know, you can't do that. There's a lot of things that are inconvenient for folks. But the way to, you know, as a millennial who does not want to own a car, I would prefer just to have public transport. But if it's cheaper and easier and faster, all three of those things for me to drive to a certain part of the city, that's what I'm going to do. And I think that a lot of folks, life is hard, it's expensive, you have no time to do anything. And if you have kids, forget about it. And so people are going to do what's most convenient for them. And although it's going to hurt and people don't necessarily want to move from the easier thing into something less easy, when soon you get to a point where public transport, active transport, that kind of stuff is the easy thing. And that's what we want to move towards.
And last I see Doug King has their hand up.
Yeah, I want to just make a point on kind of what Scott was saying. You know, we've talked a lot in lots of different ways about choice and creating communities where, you know, on the assumption people are choosing to live in a certain way. One thing that worries me about a lot of the conversations we're having, a lot of the solutions we're talking about, especially when we're focusing on creating more and more subsidized nonprofit housing sites, creating more of a share of the market, which is non-market or subsidized housing, to try to meet demand for that, is recognizing that the people who live in those housing buildings often don't have a choice of where they get to live. So if you're reliant on subsidized housing, if you can't afford market housing, you have to make an application to be accepted into subsidized housing, and you don't get to choose where you live. You get an offer, and you have to decide where to accept it or not. Probably the group that has the least choice in subsidized housing is going to be families, because there are so few family spots. If you're lucky to get accepted into subsidized housing, none of these questions about cars, walkability, none of that matters. None of that is honestly something you have agency or control over. You just have to go to the spot where you're told to go to. And one of the things that worries me when we talk about the larger solutions and creating more and more subsidized nonprofit units is it seems to be creating more and more of like a structured segregation of our housing. We have market housing where the people who can afford to live in market housing get to decide what neighborhood they get to live in, where they want to live, what type of building they want to live in. And then we have non-market subsidized housing where you don't have that choice. And then one of the other things that we see at TAPS is that when you're in subsidized housing, there are more ways to lose that housing, especially when you're talking about family units. If you're a family unit and you qualify for subsidized housing and one of your children grows up and becomes an adult and moves out, the consequence may be eviction because you no longer qualify for that unit. And our system is predicated and designed on there being enough space that when change happens, we can manage that change. We don't have that right now. We're seeing a lot more families be evicted because they no longer qualify for subsidized units. If there is a conflict, if there's something that's happening where maybe somebody needs additional supports in a subsidized building, we don't have supportive housing for families necessarily. What often happens is the children may be taken away if MCFD is involved, and then the act of taking a child away from a family would lead to not qualifying for subsidized housing as well. So, you know, we have to remember when we talk about solutions, in my personal opinion, from what we see, creating more and more subsidized housing spots run by the nonprofit societies is not the overall solution, because you're still creating a system where people are dependent on subsidies for support, and they don't have the same rights, they don't have the same access as everybody else in our society. And they're acutely aware of that. They know that. They're reminded of that all the time. So I'd really just caution us to start kind of pushing down this path, which really entrenches some of those, you know, societal differences, some of the class differences that exist in our society. You know, we're getting more and more to conversations where we're just accepting those that have to be a reality, and we don't feel like that's the case. We would like to see much more protection of existing housing stock through policies like vacancy control. We know that's a controversial policy, but if you're talking about 1 versus 15, why would we not take the more drastic measures to protect the 15 that we're losing, even if it might have a consequence and make it harder for us to build the one that we need? That's our personal feeling.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to kick it back to Andrew Cusack to ask his question.
Thanks, Kedoni. I was worried we'd run out of time, so I just put it in the chat there as well. I think Sam mentioned it early on in her initial presentation about family unit requirement, and I think we've had a lot of conversation here about rolling out the red carpet and the initiatives that we can take on supporting new construction and providing incentives, making the whole process faster, looking at land, and I think we have a number of those in place, reducing parking. We have a number of those pieces in place and are looking at a number more. But curious to hear thoughts on policies that we know are in place, that Vancouver's had in place for a very long time. Very different city, different densities, I know. So, but just curious to hear about folks' thoughts on having something like that in our region. Thanks.
I'm happy to jump in here. So one thing that stands out to me is the city of Victoria has recently adopted their missing middle housing initiative that does have a requirement for family units, so a minimum of 30% or a minimum of 2 units. And honestly, like, I've got some major issues with that policy, but I think that's one really good aspect of it. And I think given the extreme deficit of family-focused housing that we have, especially in our core area, I think we actually do need to be requiring developers to provide 3-bedroom housing, because actually the economic incentives are to provide more smaller units. Like, that's economically just like a better output from a typical developer's perspective. Like, you really need to be focused on family housing if you're going to do it on your own initiative. But I think there's a need for municipalities to be like, hey, developer, like, we need to see a certain percentage of family units. But it might, but there's a caution there, like, you know, there's a need for student housing as well and seniors housing, right? So maybe it's not a requirement for all new housing developments. Maybe it's like, here's our policy objectives, and here's different paths that you can follow that sort of, you know, gets your approval, and one of them being a family stream. So one of the most successful government programs in Canada is a CMHC rental financing program, CMHC Select. And one of the things that makes it so successful is it's super streamlined, and it's like, here's what we want to see from you. You pick, is it an affordable project? Is it an energy efficient project? Is it an accessible project? We're going to give you points. The more points you score, the better financing you're going to get. Go and build it. And we've built more rental housing under that program than we have in the last like 50 years. And it's like that kind of like simplicity and directness of like, here's what we're expecting from you. The process is easy, just go. If we want family units, like, we need that kind of like focused, disciplined thought and a bit of flexibility built in there to match like real market conditions. If we want to see sort of realistic results from this.
Awesome. And I see Laurel has her hand up.
Thanks, Kedoni. Yeah, and just maybe echoing a few of those pieces, and also noting so I sat on council before I was an MP, and one of my colleagues did bring forward actually a motion around family units and requirements, and so there were, even before the missing middle, that motion did pass, but it has a threshold of a certain size, and maybe someone from the city of Victoria knows the policy better than I'm remembering. It was 2019 when it was passed, and I think those kind of policies are important, and we need to really look at how they've been implemented, what the impact is, and then adjust them based on the data we're receiving. Because at the time, I think it was New Westminster and Victoria who were the only cities who were yeah, maybe Vancouver, who are doing that kind of requirement, and potentially those policies need to be more robust. And I think on the federal side, as we're developing the Housing Accelerator Fund, which really, is encouraging municipalities to rapidly approve housing, and especially housing that is low carbon, that is sustainable, that's affordable, that has inclusive and kind of equitable and diverse housing options. These are the kind of pieces that we need to be looking at, and also designing our federal programs to incentivize municipalities and regional districts to do the same. I just wanted to quickly note from our last conversation around kind of family friendly and walkable, incentivizing other modes of transportation, very side niche piece, but one of the things that I would love to see would be some of the incentives for electric vehicles, having comparable ones for electric bicycles. As someone who has a child and is going to be having another one very shortly, I would love to get rid of my vehicle and getting an electric bicycle with cargo pieces. Lots of folks are looking to but it is quite expensive and it is less convenient. And so the decision-making process for folks in those kind of mode switches, we need governments incentivizing other modes of transportation as much as they are electric vehicles. And so, expanding that out to walkable communities and public transit and all of those pieces that ideally are helping a broad spectrum of folks in our community.
Thank you so much for sharing those words. I think we are approaching the end of our time for this afternoon. So I just want to say again, thank you to everyone who came out today. And thank you so much to our speakers and panelists as well for taking some time out of your day to come and sit with us and talk about what makes a better city for families. Before we go though, I do have one more thing that I'd like to share with everyone. So a little bit connected to what we're talking about here and creating more housing in the city, we're going to be looking at homelessness, housing, and human rights, a look at the Housing First approach. Again, here on Zoom on May 2nd from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. The format will be similar with presenters and then a panel with some questions from us at the CSBC and some audience questions as well. Presenters and panelists at that event will be Juha Kekkonen, Chief Executive Officer at the Y Foundation, Deborah K. Paget, Professor and Affiliated Faculty at the Department of Anthropology and College of Global Public Health, and Nicole Chaland, a housing researcher and advocate here in Greater Victoria. So again, thank you so much for everyone coming out today. I believe a link to that event has been posted in chat as well. So please do sign up for that on our Eventbrite page.